Welcome back to the Mindful Living Summit. I'm Rona Walensky and I'm your host for this session. I teach mindfulness through the PassageWorks Institute and I'm a long-standing friend of the Awake Network. In today's session, our guest is Zeenat Potia, and we're going to explore one of the most important ways in which mindfulness comes off the cushion, which is in how we communicate with each other. Zeenat Potia teaches mindfulness in Boston and is an instructor for the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare System and as well as eMindful. She's taught meditation at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center for a number of years and has served on their board of directors. As an immigrant and a working mom, her teaching stems from an aspiration to create a more inclusive and sustainable world. Thank you so much for being with us today, Zeenat.
My pleasure, Rona. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we thought we would begin with a simple practice, and we would be delighted to have you lead us through that to get us settled and ready for this interesting conversation.
Lovely. Okay, so I invite you to just settle in. Very relaxed, comfortable posture. Both feet are grounded. And if it feels comfortable, gently closing the eyes. Just take a moment to make sure that your head and neck spine are aligned as if you were looking straight ahead. There's no strain in the neck, ideally. Arriving here with mind, heart, and body in this present moment. I'd like to guide this practice by offering 3 intentions. The first intention is simply to let the body be soft. So being your own guide and checking with your own physical sensory experience. If there's any tightness or gripping or clenching, anywhere in the physical body, intending to soften. Let the belly be soft. It's almost as if you're sinking into the earth element, grounding, releasing in the here and now. The second intention is to allow the heart to be tender. So bringing a loving attention to the heart region or the chest area. For some of us, we've had to learn survival strategies to toughen up or to protect ourselves in certain situations, and they've served us well. But for the purposes of this sitting practice, we can, if possible, let in some tenderness. And then the third intention is simply one word, and I offer it to you to allow it to marinate in your own experience, which is to be open. To open. In whichever way or capacity that you are able, no pushing or pressure or should or must. And then taking your time, returning and very gently opening the eyes.
Thank you so much. What a lovely way to begin our time together. I wonder if you would share with our viewers and participants a little bit of the story of how you have come to be a mindfulness meditation practitioner?
I grew up in India, in Mumbai, and the time when I was being raised in India, the country and the fabric of the city was very intensely secular. And so I grew up with a lot of different religious and spiritual traditions around me. And it piqued my interest in the spiritual life, in wanting to discover whether there was something else beyond just the frenzy of everyday living. So that was one of the seeds. Another seed was the school that I went to, also in India, had a principal who lived by the ethical values of generosity and connecting with others. And that has guided my journey throughout my professional life and now my life as a meditation teacher. This idea of giving back and of being of service, which growing up in India, there was ample opportunities to do that. But coming here, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 20 years, working in various different professions over, this 2-decade period of being a newspaper reporter, of working in communications in the nonprofit industry and education. And then as a parallel to that, exploring my own practice. I see myself first and foremost as a practitioner of mindfulness and then a teacher. And it has been an alignment of mission-driven work, of coming to seeing the difference that mindfulness can make in people's lives. Having experienced it myself, the power to transform one's experience from disconnection to connection. And that, I would say, is one of the main reasons why I do this work, and I believe in it very, very passionately.
So as we approach today's topic, can you tell us what you mean by communication? It's one of those words that we all use, but sometimes it's helpful to define terms. So maybe we could begin there. If we're going to think about mindful communication, we might want to think about what communication is to begin with.
Thank you, Rona, for that very grounding question. I would say that as human beings, we are intensely social creatures. We have a biological imperative to want to be with others, to connect with others. And speaking and listening, speech is one of the ways in which we do that. And I would say that all of us have a need to want to relate. So it's a relational aspect of our nature. And what does it mean to communicate mindfully? I would argue that mindfulness and communication, in a sense, are part of the same coin. They cannot be separated. I would like to bring Mary Oliver into the conversation by quoting her when she said that attention is the beginning of devotion. And so when we give others the gift of our attention, of our leading with presence, then we're setting up the stage for communicating in a way that is harmonious, that is respectful of the other and respectful of ourselves, of our own intentions and motivations and where we're coming from. So really it is the baseline. And as you know, words have immense power to heal, to soothe, to comfort. And then the opposite is true as well. Words have the power to separate, to create harshness and aggression. And so then it becomes on us as a responsibility, as part of this human connected species, to take that on as a practice of mindful communication, as a way of being in the world.
So could you give us some examples of what, before we get to how to be more mindful in our communication, what does not so mindful communication look like and sound like? You used some words, harshness and lack of consideration. Those are pretty big words, but maybe some concrete examples of less than perfect communication.
Sure. Most of the time, when people are interacting in a communication context, they're not really that interested in listening. I think we've lost the art of listening well. And so folks are interested in, when am I going to speak next? How do I get this person to do what I want? Things like seeing the other person almost as a means to an end. So objectifying the other and not really being there, kind of being checked out. And oftentimes when people are speaking, that was the role of the listening or the lack of listening mindfully. But when we're speaking, we're being driven by our habitual impulses. So we don't even know it, but there is like a rush to when we speak without having a sense. When the mindfulness is not present, then there is an energy of rushing. And there's also, you may feel in the body tightness and tension, kind of a contraction of speaking from a place of habit, or just the momentum of our kind of predilections or preoccupations or feeling lost. And I think that tends to lead to reactivity. So if we're not aware of what our intentions or impulses are, we just react out of habit, repeating patterns of behavior that maybe often are indeed unwise or cause harm to ourselves and to others. And so, there's a reason why, unfortunately, we're living in a time of great strife and conflict. And a lot of it has to do with communication that is not mindful, that is not receptive or open or respectful, if you will, and creates conflict and misunderstanding among, in our personal relationships, but also I speak at the global level.
I guess I would add to that list of reasons or examples of miscommunication is the ways in which people are checking their phones.
Yes, thank you, Rona. That I would say, is the other. The presence of the other. Technology has brought us great gifts, but really has also caused a lot of difficulty among human interaction. I find, I see at my own dinner table, sometimes when the kids are going off, the grown-ups might be itching to see what's on a device. And sometimes it's just emptiness or boredom, waiting in line at the post office. Or this morning, as I was in line waiting to vote, because it's primary day, Super Tuesday in some states in the United States, I noticed in the long lines, people were checking their phones. And not to villainize and not to say that that's a bad thing, but what it does is that it leads to separation and it leads to lack of presence. When we're checking our devices, we're not really in the moment anymore. We're somewhere else. We've left the building. And that really is a huge impediment to communicating mindfully. Thank you for mentioning that.
So could you describe for us in general terms and maybe some specific terms what mindful communication looks like? And I think we might even want to bring into the picture not just the verbal communication, but the nonverbal communication.
I'd like to start by offering a framework to think about mindful communication, and it's inspired by the Eightfold Path of Buddhist teachings, which is wise speech, which is one of the path factors of the Eightfold Path. And it's very simple, and offer it in secular terms, a few questions to check in to see if we're communicating mindfully. And I do this all the time in my own life. And in fact, it was crucial to my training as a journalist. And the questions are, is it true? Is it necessary, relevant, and timely? Is it harmonious? And I'm forgetting. Is it pleasing? To your point of the nonverbal, is it pleasing and gentle? So just to go over again, is it true? Is it necessary, timely, and relevant? Is it harmonious? And is it pleasing and gentle? And so one can check in, and very quickly it becomes clear when we're not, how to guide our mindful communication using these check-in points. Because very often we find that that's not the case, where even if it's the first question, is it true? A small white lie, one might think, oh, no one's going to know, but you know. And that's where the integrity comes in, bringing in always this thing of how do we act and behave when nobody is watching, when we are held accountable to our own standards of integrity. And then the other, considering that when we speak, our words have power, and they have power on us and on others. So is it harmonious, or is it malicious, or is it maligning somebody who isn't there? Are we speaking of people who aren't in the room, speaking behind their back, or idle chatter? Is it necessary? Is it relevant? And when we speak, are we using brevity, or are we taking up so much airtime not considering that others may have a contribution, or maybe somebody who wouldn't normally speak, are we making space for them so that they feel comfortable and empowered to share their voice? Are we considering all voices? Are we including all voices? Very, very crucial. And then in terms of nonverbal, tone is very important. So very good to check in before, during, and after speech. So before is to be aware of one's intentions. Are we speaking with the intention of connecting, the intentions of bringing kindness and compassion into the picture, with the intention to understand the other, understand ourselves? Or are we being guided by the intentions of greed, hatred, and delusion, which just lead us down an unwholesome path? So that's before we speak. During, one can check in with the physical body. What's going on in the heart? Is there a knot in one's belly? Are our eyes hardening or tightening? And then after, our words have immense resonance. They have an emotional residue. How does it feel in the body? How does it feel in our hearts after we've spoken? And then we get data, we get input, because often we're speaking with somebody else or with a group of people. What is the energy in the room? How are people taking it in? These are all things that we learn to do. I think when mindfulness is present, when our attention is not so fragmented, when we lead with presence, we can incorporate all of these things into bringing mindfulness into our communication.
So I'm sure participants are thinking, that's a really long checklist. What I have to answer those questions, and then I have to think about before and during and after. So I think you began to make the connection to, if it's just a checklist, it probably is not going to be a very effective. But so could you make more explicit the connection between showing up as a mindful communicator and one's own mindfulness practices?
A wonderful way to transition to emphasize that our speech comes from silence, that silence has an immense regenerative power, and that the more we know our quiet mind, the better equipped we will be to be in relation, to be in the world when we are speaking. And so I cannot emphasize this enough, that the value and the power of the formal sitting practice of mindfulness meditation. And encourage everybody who might be watching that if you're curious, if you don't have a practice, to look into it. And if you have a practice, then this is just another reminder, a motivating factor to get on the cushion. Because when we come into a posture, an upright posture, we begin with tapping into our inherent dignity, and that posture and then coming into stillness and quiet contemplation. A mindful body is a still body, is a quiet body. And then we see in that silence, we meet discomfort, we meet disappointment, and we learn how to be with it. We cultivate resilience. And this happens on the cushion. This happens by focusing the attention over and over again on whatever one's chosen anchors are. It could be the breath, it could be sounds, it could be physical sensations in the body. However you choose, or whichever techniques you choose to quiet the mind, that's where our training begins. That's where we begin to forge this toolkit, so that then that checklist that I had, that doesn't seem so daunting. And it's not even then that mindful communication becomes a project. It almost is something that begins to develop internally, and then it's not so in the moment. We've already cultivated patience. We've cultivated a way of being with our experiences, difficult, challenging, conflict, different emotions and thoughts conflicting internally. We've looked at them. We've been able to meet them with those same qualities that then we can bring to our mindfulness communication. And especially that very, I think, most beautiful of questions in that checklist of, is it true? I think we see that a lot in the sitting practice, because we see very clearly we begin to at least our experience for what it is.
I know as someone who's practiced meditation, mindfulness and meditation for a number of years, there can still be a gap between the habits I develop on the cushion and then the behaviors that emerge when I'm out in the world and I get captivated again by my habitual patterns are sort of triggered. So do you have a suggestion for people of how to as they're about to have a conversation, or just an ordinary conversation? We'll get to difficult conversations in a little bit, but they're just talking because they're a human being and they're in the office, or they're not looking at their phone and they say something to the person at the bus stop or at the voting line, but what do you invite people to consider in the moment of speech?
What you describe, Rona, of slipping into the habitual ways of being, Pema Chodron has this phrase that she uses, getting hooked, and the word in Tibetan is shempa, and it has that quality of just getting hooked, of getting on that bandwagon of habit. And so I'd like to mention Oren J. Sofer has this book called Mindful Communication of Say What You Mean. The title is Say What You Mean, A Nonviolent Guide to Mindful Communication. And in that he has a very simple kind of outline, and it's been helpful to me, and I'd like to offer it with giving credit to him. And the first is to lead with presence. So just checking in with your breath, with your body. It takes a moment to just check in. So leading with presence, so coming into a mindful awareness. And then come into curiosity and care. So engaging or intending to engage with curiosity, and that word curiosity indicates a desire to understand and connect. So you're not going into it already armored for battle, which I think a lot of us do. We start with that stance of defensiveness. So curiosity, it has that quality of what I led with in the sitting, of being open. And then care simply means goodwill. So much of again, we go into things with a lot of doubt, suspicion, fear of the other. There's a lot of fear of the other right now in the climate generally. And so what if we just went in with a sense of goodwill for ourselves, for our own intentions, and then for the other that we're going to be engaging with? And then being very clear of what our needs are, so that we're aware of what would be driving our intentions, aware of the needs, and then feeling empowered to share openly and honestly whatever our requests may be, or what, why we're going into this. I think, and then I'll throw in my own into Oren's mix, which is respect. I think respect for one's own dignity, and then seeing the other who we're communicating with respect. And it doesn't matter if they have a completely different point of view or an opinion from you. In fact, that's an opportunity to really practice more. Or if you've had a very difficult conflict with them, so you're going into it feeling kind of already really upset or sad, or if there's harm has been present, one can still, if possible, sprinkle in a little bit of a dose of respect and understanding that ultimately we're all acting out of a common human motivation to be happy, to realize our own happiness. And if we remind ourselves that, and it's very easy to forget because it's very easy to villainize. And I think I'll stop there.
What strikes me is the invitation for someone who already is a practitioner and is spending time on the cushion or in other venues practicing mindfulness and stillness, the invitation to see communication as a practice, and to recognize that this is a moment to take it off the cushion, and that every encounter is an opportunity for more practice. And for me, that's a helpful connection of not just there's the cushion and then there's the rest of life, but that in these moments of communication, we can be very intentionally bringing our practice to bear. And we're not going to do it perfectly, of course. When we were preparing for this conversation, we chatted with each other about another formal practice, which is not the way normal conversation has, but the practice of mindful listening and speaking, which is something that is a not silent practice, but sort of gets us a little more prepared for practicing in real time. Would you be willing to share with people what that practice looks like? I don't know if we can actually practice it here for them, but I think you can describe it.
I'll be happy to. It's such a rich area of practice, and in my own classes, especially with younger segments of the population, I work with a group regularly of 18 to 35-year-olds, and we do a lot of dyad work, and the dyad work is centered around mindful speaking and listening. And so mindful listening is what I'd like to begin with, because I want to bring in Thich Nhat Hanh, who described that as deep listening or generous listening. There's a generosity that we offer when we listen deeply. And Joan Halifax, Buddhist teacher and hospice worker, refers to it as listening with all your heart. And so really leaving nothing out when we listen. And so that kind of full embodied listening, taking in what the other person is saying without thinking about our own, what we're going to say next, or our own agenda, or judging them. And that's a gift. That's a gift that is rare in the world that we live in. And so just even, beginning to be bringing that into the listening practice can be an act of resistance, an act of empowerment. And then mindful speaking, as an interactive practice with the listening, is not interrupting. So one person speaks, the other offers their full listening, and the person who's speaking is fully aware of their internal intentions, their impulses, their physical sensations, whatever may be going on, and they're able to speak with their authenticity, they're able to speak their truth in that space. So it creates a safe container for speaking and listening. It's not often the back and forth that happens. It's not really a conversation. It's more like a mirror. Holding up a mirror is another way to describe mindful speaking and listening.
When I teach it, and I'm going to be teaching it this afternoon to a group of nurses, I invite people to stand next to each other and not look at each other as they begin to just practice listening and just speaking, so that they take out the social cues. And it's sort of something to work up to just listen to somebody and not do the nodding and the smiling and the approving and which can be very distracting. For those people who want to practice, I would also let them know that it's helpful to have a timer so that each person has an equal amount of time, and that's how much you get to speak, and then you're done, and then the other person gets to speak. And if you find a buddy, it just gets you that much closer to practicing actual speaking and listening when you are having what is a more normal conversation. Is there anything else you would add?
No, I do like your reminders of the social cues. I'll often say sometimes the speaking, the smiling, and the kind of eye contact stuff, it's very habitual. So I like the not seeing one another, taking that out of it. I do tell my students when they do it that sometimes, if this person speaking says something funny and there is a natural response, to allow that to be, to not, because they may take the instruction to feel like they have to be a wooden board and not respond at all. So to try to be as natural as possible. And then I do, and I'm glad you brought it up, of the time. So I will typically ring a bell and keep time, so that when they know when it's time to switch. So there's a structure built into the speaking and listening container. Oh, actually, I do want to add one more thing, which is I often give the instruction, and it sounds very basic, but really useful to remind folks that you're not there to be their therapist, their friend, not there to solve their problems or answer their questions. because that is also a very conditioned response that a lot of us have during speaking and listening. So to take that out of it can be very freeing, and it can also allow the person speaking to speak without any kind of fear that the other one is going to jump in with solutions. So there's more openness and flow.
Inevitably, when I teach this and people practice it for the first time, there's quite a large group of people who just hate it because it is not familiar, and it's not what they're used to, and they're used to both nodding and affirming, and especially I work with teachers and nurses, they're caregivers and they just want to make people feel good, and the people who are speaking are often used to entertaining or getting validation back. So and yet when I teach it in a long course and people practice it every week, they come to find it to be one of the most powerful practices. So if anyone out there decides they want to find a buddy to practice mindful listening and speaking with, just know that it will be awkward in the beginning, and I think it will grow on you. So let's talk a little bit about difficult conversations. So there are many different kinds, but let's imagine that you are about to have a conversation with somebody you have some kind of conflict with, or you're afraid the other person might not like what you have to say. So you have that sense of dread in your belly and elsewhere in your body that you're about to do something hard. What suggestions do you have for people about how to prepare for that kind of difficult conversation?
Difficult conversations are really where the rubber meets the road, where we can bring a lot of the training from the toolkit of practice to the real world. And so what guides me and what I would encourage people to be guided by is just the principle of going into it with the intention of doing no harm, either to oneself or to others. And to oneself is being very clear about what your boundaries are and not being afraid to hold to them. So sometimes when people hear, kind speech, they think they misunderstand it as betraying one's own impulses or needs or taking care of oneself. And I think that just leads to disaster. It's not a wholesome way to be in the world. And so that's not what that means. That in fact, you need to include yourself in the kind speech and in the doing no harm principle. So going into it with that, because that takes away or has the potential to take away some of the charge of the difficult conversation. And then I'd like to offer just a tried and tested technique, again from Thich Nhat Hanh, who has this practice it's called beginning anew. And it's specifically offered for dealing with conversations that have conflict or misunderstanding, and with the offering that it can lead to healing in relationships and more harmonious communication. And so there's 3 aspects to it. The first is conscious breathing. Second is kind speech and compassionate listening. And those are kind of the overarching values that encompass this practice. And in effect, what it looks like is coming together with the other person. Now, the other person may not be a practitioner, right? So keeping that in mind, you can do it. You can do the conscious breathing piece to just, when you're sitting at the table or wherever the conversation is happening, to just connect to the breath. It can be 5 breaths. Just that very act of pausing, of beginning to calm and regulate your own nervous system. What Dan Siegel calls flipping back the lid. When our lid is flipped, when our nervous system is out of whack, is when we go into fight or flight. So doing whatever practices that that allow you to regulate that is a starting point. And then courage. Courage can be very good to have, because the courage to speak frankly and honestly about whatever the disappointment or the conflict is, to not shy away from that. Because sometimes the easier thing might look like, I don't want to go there because it's too hard or too difficult. And we see this in our sitting practice. We meet some discomfort, we want to back away from it. There's an aversion. And so leaning into the discomfort, being honest about whatever is the heart of the conflict, and speaking with courage, because it does take risk. It takes making yourself vulnerable by speaking that way. Checking in to see if you're honoring and being true to yourself, and then looking for information, for data to see how that's being received on the other end. Speaking with an intention to understand, so bringing that in, and then you can convey that to the other person who may or may not be the source of the conflict, but who you're engaging with, that you are coming from a place of wanting to understand and resolve rather than escalate. And then in the to close it out, you may make a request, you may set up a boundary. If things start to go out of hand and unravel, where the other person, let's say, turns very much more hostile, then you can say, I see that you're disturbed, I see that you're having difficulty, I will need to end this conversation now in order to protect myself, or in order to just take a step back or take a break. And it's very, very good to say that, to do that. And that's a response that comes from wisdom, coming from a place of being connected to your experience. If you go into fight or flight or go into reactivity mode, then it's going to be a shouting match. So just some tips and ideas, and I offer these, and as all of you watching know, that they're just guidelines, because things unfold as they unfold. And as Rona very wisely pointed out, that we have these intentions, we may have these tools, but ultimately it is a practice. We're all human beings, and we are learning as we go. So not to get discouraged or disheartened. In fact, there's so much division and separation in the world today, and some of it might seem insurmountable. And the way I approach that, or how I'm trying to approach that or begin with, is really not clinging so hard to my own views and opinions, trying to stay a little more open, not seeing it as us against them, as two parties, but really trying to see where the points of connection can be, where we can listen to one another. Even if we disagree, can there be listening? Can there be deep and generous listening, as Thich Nhat Hanh said?
I think there are two guidelines that are implicit in what you just said that I'd like to tease out, and maybe you want to say more about it, maybe that's not necessary. One is that you are really encouraging people to have conversations in real time and in person, and not through tweets and emails. And the other is that I heard, or that I inferred, is that you don't have the conversation when you yourself are in a place of strong emotional reaction, that you need to have settled yourself. You may get triggered again, and you can speak to how you might handle it. But if you know you're setting up a conversation that's difficult, you don't want to have it in the heat of the moment, when you're less likely to be skillful.
Yes, indeed. And face to face, if it's a choice, really is the way to go, because human beings, coming back down to our ancestral nature, there's so much in body language that gets lost over the electronic transmissions, and especially social media, I think is the primary culprit in a lot of creation of misunderstanding and missed wires. And so if it's possible to be in the same physical space as another, where you can read the body language, and perhaps there's hope of there being some softening when there's more information if we're in one another's physical spaces, and we see the person in a three-dimensional way. We see the whole, rather than it's much easier to objectify or to villainize an image and a tweet or a text message, because it's that we don't have to rub against the humanity of the other. And so as much as possible to reconnect on a human level in person is valuable. And then to your second point of emotional regulation, really of our own nervous system, and that's one of the gifts that our mindfulness practice gives us. And so definitely not picking up the phone or storming into doors when those lids are off, when we're steaming, when we're stewing, when we've been set off or triggered, would not be a good time to engage. To engage when we have a sense of groundedness, of connectivity, of self-awareness, and then we can go into it integrating all of those values that are near and dear to us. The values haven't just suddenly vanished because we've turned into an ancestor on the prairie running away from a stealthy snake, or whatever it may be, where our reptilian, mammalian brains go.
You mentioned, suppose you come into the conversation and you're regulated and it's in person, and you shared that if the other person starts to react as opposed to respond, you invited people to gently end the conversation. What's your advice when it's ourselves, when I go into the conversation and I go in with all my good intentions and I've practiced all morning and and we're in person, and then suddenly I'm all upset again? What should I do?
The first thing I would say is to pause. There is pausing and slowing down is underrated. So and you may feel the heat rising, and the pausing, just literally stopping to the speech. And you may take a second, and you can even say to the person, I just need to take a beat. I need to pause for a second. And the practice can be different for different people. For me personally, I like to connect into the physical body, because I find there is nothing like that to begin to ground me in the present moment. And so sometimes the body can feel unsafe if there is trauma present, etc. And I think that requires some training, or working with somebody who's trained in that, to know how to approach that. So I just want to flag that, because it's not always wise to go to the breath if you have a trauma response, because that can lead to more panic and re-traumatize. So connecting into physical sensation, and fear and anger often manifest as heat for me personally, and so I can feel the sensation of heat rising, feel tightness or contraction, and then just in that pausing, something powerful happens. Something powerful can switch, or an insight may arise of what the next course of action can be for you in that moment. So it's, again, it is not like there's a handbook, but that's what our practice teaches us, is it empowers us to make those choices in the moment when there is spaciousness, even a few moments of spaciousness. Then we can choose our response, our next response, rather than just being driven by the momentum of the habitual responses. So in that pausing in the space, I may say, you know what, I've hit my wall, I've hit my limit. I'm really too upset right now. I don't think I can continue in a way that without causing further harm or shutting down. And so that doesn't mean, making that empowered decision or choice to end the conversation does not, in this instance, the way I've described it, doesn't mean running away or shutting down. Because some people, again, may misinterpret, you're bailing because it's too hard. No, actually, I've taken a beat, and it just wouldn't be wise for me to continue. So then it's fine to table for another time. Or it may be that you may decide, this is really hard right now, but I need to stay in it. I need to stay in it because I do have a tendency when it gets too hard to want to just check out. So is that what's happening? You can check in with your intention, and being brutally honest here can serve you well, and only you can know that. And I think we do. A lot of us, when we get quiet, it becomes very clear. And then you to feel strong to state, and to if we're going into this with those values or things that we've laid down of dignity for ourselves, dignity for the other person, then some of these things become less charged, become less intense, allows us to make wise decisions in the moment. So.
We have just a couple of more minutes left, and you alluded earlier to difficult political conversations, and as we are entering the heated election year. What other advice would you like to share with people who are listening as we close our session today?
Thank you for that very poignant question, Rona. We do indeed live in very deep, dark, troubling, difficult times, and many people are feeling overwhelmed, powerless, disappointed, sad, and it's an opportunity for us to bring mindfulness into the sphere of public discourse. And I would say to begin with deep listening, to come into presence where we recognize our own echo chambers, because a lot of us are in our various bubbles, whatever they may be, and to begin to see if we can loosen the grip on our own agendas, our own views and opinions. And that's not to say that we let go of them, or we sell out, or we change our minds. That's not what I'm suggesting, but just to notice if there are places where there's a lot of holding on, there's a lot of unwillingness to connect or to consider that there may be another side. We can bring in this practice of deep listening and stepping out of the echo chamber, and then come into it from a place of non-harm, of de-escalating aggression. It is always possible to sprinkle in some kindness, and ways in which one can engage of being of service in one's community can be a way to alleviate others' suffering. So making a contribution. Generosity can be a practice that can begin to empower us as a way of doing something, of helping others. So generosity, and then gratitude, being aware of what is working, what can we celebrate, even within, and I mean certainly in our own personal lives, but really in the bigger picture. What are some role models or people who we admire, who are leading the walk of kindness, generosity, compassion, tolerance, patience? Can we get behind them? Can we learn from them? Can we support them in our own way? And then making space for those with whom we disagree. And really, this is an opportunity to bring our mindfulness practice off the cushion into the world. And we have the opportunity to create a better world with our mindfulness practice in how we interact and communicate with one another.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, your guidance, and I hope that people take to heart your suggestions for how we can make this a much less troubling time. Zeenat, Potia, thank you so much for joining the Mindful Living Summit.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Rona.